is a cumulative, tragic failure of our institutions over Grenfell at so many levels.
Now, where does the money go?
Where do you think the money goes?
This Everyday People episode gets into the world of social housing. In America, that's the projects. In the UK, it's the council estate. In Scotland, it's the scheme. It also touches on the Grenfell Tower Disaster, so that's just a little bit of a sensitivity warning. Also, just want to say that the location I chose it purely because it's local. This video in no way implies any criticism of that particular development. For all I know, it's an extremely good development, may well be. Today we have Walter, the social housing architect.
What is it you do every day?
What I'm doing now is I'm a housing enabler. I seek to identify opportunities where housing can be provided, social housing, also looking for affordable housing, housing for housing associations or the registered providers, and research in terms of some planning issues to do with resilience, climate change, which has always been a strand of the work that I did in practice to try and understand some of the core fundamentals that we need to address going forward. And we can see some of those fundamentals happening, of course, on this site. Things like the notions of embodied energy, how our fiscal regulations with regards to VAT inform development, because VAT incentivizes demolition rather than the reuse of buildings, and it does so in a number of ways. So in residential development, if you knock down and rebuild, VAT frequently is zero rated. Refurbishment, it's 20%. So there's a 20% incentive essentially to knock down buildings. I mean, essentially the argument is it should be entirely a level playing field. My own view is, of course, you should actually have an incentive towards the refurbishment of buildings through having a preferential VAT rate on refurbishment of buildings, so essentially swap it around completely. And that would mean we do not waste the energy that we've used in building and constructing these flats in the first place. We look creatively at how we use the structures and the fabrics that are there, and that's one way that we're going to address climate change, because construction is consuming about 40% of CO2 emissions in the UK.
So what gets you up every morning, Walter, to motivate you to do this?
Cup of coffee. I've always had a commitment to the idea that everyone deserves a decent home, everyone, and that essentially the rich are well placed to provide their own. They have the capacity and the resources, and if I have a knowledge and skill, I see that as a social responsibility. So this sort of development, I know because when we were invited to tender about 25 years or so ago on this, has been in the pipeline for a very, very long period of time. Now, what of course happens is that these processes rumble on like a huge supertanker, and then over time, finances change, development remits change, political authority changes, and all these things. So the certainty of the delivery, in other words, who it's for, almost becomes less material than the fact that we are delivering. Well, the social upshot is, at a time when we are in desperate need of social housing, when there is huge inflation in property prices and people are being forced out, massive energy problems with people's actual accommodation that they're in at the moment, the money is going into essentially the private purse and to, in my view, the enslavement of the population into a banking system where they spend the rest of their lives paying off their mortgages because the mortgages are so enormous. You asked me what gets me up in the morning, and I think that's one of the examples of what gets me up in the morning as well. It's very simple, very robust, but so is most of our historic housing, very simple and robust of that nature. And as you can see, it's delightful. It's got great orientation, it's picking up the sun here. As the sun moves around, it's going to get the sun into its back area in the evening. Really nice little just street housing. So you immediately see it when we get here that the buildings have been brought out to the street front. So that side of the road, relative to the older side of the road, does not have the setback lines. There are sort of benefits to doing that in terms of the efficiency of land use if you have a housing crisis and are trying to, of course, house many more people in the same area.
So what's the best experience you've had in terms of trying to get social housing built?
In terms of the best that I think I've sort of delivered would have been a scheme where the intention was to try and deliver very low energy housing on a fairly sizable scale, so it's 56 dwellings. The smaller bedroom two-person flats were designed so that they could all be linked together, so they could, if they like, have a party space. Because I always thought it was very inappropriate that the plans of flats were often so boxed up that people couldn't actually have a social space in which to invite more than perhaps 3 or 4 friends. And so it allowed for that as well. So it had very high energy, embodied that. I mean, it was visited by the all-party parliamentary committee on housing, and they were very commending of it as well at the time.
What's the worst experience of all of this?
I suppose the heartbreak has been for me in my career as an architect is seeing so much work being transferred over into design-build contracts. With the design-build contract, what happens is the architect works for the builder. So the client has a single point of contact, which they think is an advantage, because they only have to talk to the builder, who employs the architect who's supposed to be sustaining the quality. Well, this doesn't happen because the pressure on the contractor is to make profit. And we've seen this at Grenfell. We've seen the loss of the professionalism of supervision, administration happening throughout the system. And this has been going on throughout my life. So I have seen some of the worst outputs of mine happen where we were employed to design a scheme, develop the scheme on the basis that we would be supervising its build. It's then been handed over to a contractor and completely bastardized, because the standard and quality for the price that was paid was not what it should have been, anywhere near.
And where does the money go?
Where do you think the money goes? The money goes to making it more profitable for the developers and the contractors to be building. I haven't used the Grenfell type of cladding ever, but the pressure on people to use it is huge. And
why is it huge?
Well, if the standards and regulations say something can be used and the price of it is lower than another product, what is going to be used? The cheaper one.
So the government sets the standards?
Absolutely. They say what they do is they set the standards and also the methods by which the standards are evaluated, and they've privatized those. So there's a direct conflict of interest in with the privatized standards certification authorities in the UK. They used to be independent government agencies. They all got privatized. So it is a cumulative, tragic failure of our institutions over Grenfell at so many levels. It's absolutely tragic.
What's the big life lesson you've learnt from engaging in all of this?
I suppose there are 2 answers to that. One is, I have seen many European countries progress much more rapidly towards much better solutions, and I think we have an awful lot of lessons to learn from there, but we're too myopic to look beyond the channel now. On a personal level, what I've learned is I suppose I'm far more patient than I used to be, and I've also got to a position which I'm not sure is good or bad, of being much more diplomatic about what I say and when I say it. Despite starting off as an extreme leftist when I was young, I'm probably more extreme now than I was then.
This is early days when they were just obviously pulling the buildings down. He was doing the chopping and he was doing the digging.